like this, Jesus said. The kingdom of heaven is like this. A king gave a wedding banquet for his son. And then what unfolds is that really odd story. An odd story that only Matthew tells, at least with this edge on it. There's a story in Luke's gospel that seems almost similar, but if you put them side by side, they really are two different stories, and this one has an edge on it. The king sends out the invitations, and then all sorts of bizarre things start to happen. Maybe another story will help us catch the drift of this one. Back at the beginning of my ministry, my first church was in Paxton. While I was living in Paxton, my neighbor was a major in the United States Air Force. This was back in the days when Chanute Air Force Base was still an active Air Force base, and Major Ganter Sir was my next door neighbor. We were sitting one day chatting about life, and he was telling me how life in his world in some ways is a little different from life in my world. For example, when the base commander sends out invitations to the officers and their dates for a gala, whatever, that he's going to host 2 weeks from this coming Friday, well, in my household, when an invitation like that comes, I look at the calendar and I sit down with Pam and we talk about it and we decide what we're going to do together, and then we make our announcement, our RSVP. But I'm not an officer in the United States Air Force, and that makes a bit of a difference. My next door neighbor, the major, told me how it works for an officer on a base in the United States Air Force. The language is invitational. I'm throwing a party and I would like you to come. I would like you to bring your wife. I would like you to come and enjoy my party, the party I'm going to throw. The language is invitational, but the officers know how to read between the lines. Do you want your career? Do you want your next promotion? So unless you are in the hospital having a heart transplant that particular Friday night, where are you going to be? And where is your wife going to be? In those days, the officers were almost always men, and most of them married, and the wife didn't get a buy on this one either. You know where you will be, and you know where your wife is going to be, because that's how it is. And that's how it is in this parable. When the king sends out the invitations the first time around, who does the king invite? Who gets the invitations the first time? The big shots in the realm, the officers of the court, the economic kingpins, the political playmakers, the business big shots, the religious big shots, all of those people who run the country, they are the people who get the invitations, the people who hold the country together, the people upon whose loyalty and upon whose commitment the king depends in order to administer the realm. And they will accept the invitation. They will accept it because this is one of the ways they demonstrate their loyalty to the king. This is one of the ways they show their respect to his throne and to his power and to his authority. That's just how it is. Except in this story. What happened in this story? It happened over and over and over. So this wasn't just one sort of wild card fluke, but in the story, one after another ignores the invitation. One after another ignores, and then after a while, one after another begins to seize the king's slaves, the king's messengers, mistreating them, killing them, one after another. So this isn't just an isolated event. What we have going on here, people, is a revolt, an insurrection, a kind of rebellion. And so to stay in power, what does the king do? What do kings always do when there is an insurrection? What do kings always do when there's a rebellion? We've seen it happen over and over in this whole Arab Spring movement in our own time. So we know what happens. When the king senses rebellion, the king sends out the army to quash the rebellion and to flatten it, to destroy it, and in the process to kill and destroy and burn so that all who resist the reign are put out of the place. So that's what happened in the story. But still, there's the son, who is married, who needs to celebrate his wedding. And the meal is cooked and the cake is baked and it's all ready to go. So who is going to come? Who is going to celebrate? Because we must celebrate the marriage of the king's son. The wedding is ready, the story said, but those who were invited were not worthy. So go out into the streets and invite everyone you find to come to the wedding. And so the slaves went out into the streets and they gathered everyone they could find, the good people and the bad people, and they brought them to the wedding hall, and the wedding hall was filled and there was a glorious celebration. That's the parable. That's the parable. And you know how parables are. They are stories that also have some other kind of meaning. They are told to help us understand something else. Any guesses about what Matthew is trying to help us understand? Here again, we have to do a little bit of reading between the lines. But each of the gospel writers was writing to a particular group of people, a particular situation, a particular experience that a particular group of people was having as they tried to figure out how to follow Jesus. And most of this gospel writing stuff is happening 30, 40, 50 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So the community is trying to find its way, and Jesus has already ascended into heaven. So it's a rather tricky little process going on here. And Matthew, as near as we can tell, is writing to a group of people who used to worship in the big synagogue. They used to worship in the big synagogue together with their family and their friends and their neighbors. All of the people would gather in the big synagogue to worship, and they've been doing it that way for years and years. They've been doing it that way for generations. Even after they began to follow Jesus, they worshiped in the same synagogue, just like Jesus and his first disciples worshiped in the synagogues in the towns where they traveled. That's how it was. Until things started to get a little dicey. The gap between the two groups began to grow and get larger. And after a while, perhaps 30 or 40 years after the death of Jesus and his resurrection, the synagogue leaders excommunicated the followers of Jesus, pushed them out. And it would seem very likely that Matthew has been writing these stories to encourage and strengthen these excommunicated followers of Jesus, to help them see themselves perhaps in a little bit different light from what they had been seeing themselves. Maybe as Matthew sees it, the synagogue leaders are like the people who ignored the king's invitation. They rejected the king's authority. They rejected the king's son. They rebelled against the king's rule. And so perhaps as Matthew sees it, the king does what the king needs to do. But the banquet hall is still empty, and the wedding must be celebrated, and the king's son must be honored. So what happened? A whole different group of people is invited. Anybody who was willing to come, no matter who you are, no matter where you are in life's journey. Anybody remember that phrase? It's part of our own identity now. No matter who you are, no matter where you are in life's journey, might well have come from this understanding of this particular parable. You are welcome here, our invitational statement in the United Church of Christ. And so a whole new crowd fills the hall. A crowd who displaces the old crowd who were invited but were now slaughtered because they had rebelled. At least maybe that's how Matthew sees it. And who is the new crowd? The people who follow Jesus. They are the people who belong now at the king's table, at the place of honor. And they belong simply because they received the invitation. They belong simply because they showed up. So Matthew's telling this storytelling encourages and strengthens that little band of Jesus people who felt like they really were a band of nobodies. Maybe they can run you out of the big steeple church. Maybe they can run you out of town, but they can't run you away from Jesus. They can't run you away from God's table. Not even if you are like so many of those who followed Jesus in the beginning, the prostitutes and the crooks and the overindulgers and the people who were disloyal to the old traditions, because even the bad folk were invited. Even the bad folk were embraced, simply because they accepted the invitation, simply because they showed up, just because you showed up. Just because you accepted the invitation. Now all of this is true. All of this is historically true. And if you don't push the theology too hard, theologically it's true. I say don't push it too hard because you don't have to push very much at all until you're into the theology of the Christian identity movement or the Christian militia movement. You don't have to push that theology very hard until you have the religious underpinning of the neo-Nazi movement. So be careful. Don't push it too hard. But it is true. It is true. And we, for whom it is true, might get a little bit smug about it. We are the special people now. We are the ones the king liked. as we start to get smug, Matthew spells a wrap. Yes, the king is generous. Yes, the king is gracious. But the king is also the king. The king whose authority must be respected. The king whose rule must be honored. And so Matthew adds that other little piece to the story. Even for this crowd, this new crowd, certain things are expected. And everybody knew it, and everybody honored it, except for one. The one man who showed up without the wedding robe. Now, nobody today knows what in the world Matthew is talking about here. We don't know what the wedding robe is. We don't know why everybody would have one. We don't know why this one guy didn't have one or showed up without it. Indeed, when the king questioned him, the man was speechless. And from then until now, gallons of ink have been spilled on reams of paper as scholars and commentators try to make sense out of this little scene. And for the most part, they fail. We don't really know what was going on here exactly. But if our brains can't figure it out, our guts get the point. Our guts get the point. Insiders do not get a free pass. Insiders do not get a free pass. They didn't before, and they don't now. Insiders don't get a free pass. Not them, not you, not me. Grace and generosity got us to the party. Grace and generosity got us to the table, but don't presume on the grace. Don't presume on the generosity. Don't get smug. Don't get lazy. Because you see, this invitation that you received was an invitation into a life-changing encounter. And because you responded to the invitation, you entered into a new way of life. The mercy that brought you here made you into new people. That's the